When 17-year-old Marcus Thompson stepped onto that makeshift stage in the Millbrook High School gymnasium, wearing his father's oversized plaid shirt and mud-stained work boots, the crowd of 300 people fell silent for all the wrong reasons. What happened next would shatter every assumption they'd ever made about the quiet boy from Riverside Farm. Marcus Thompson had perfected the art of invisibility. In a school where being different meant being a target, he'd learned to move through hallways like smoke, slipping past lockers and classrooms without leaving so much as a ripple in his wake. At 6'2", with calloused hands that spoke of early mornings feeding livestock and shoulders that carried the weight of his family's struggling farm, Marcus should have commanded attention. Instead, he seemed to fold inward, as to try and take up as little space as possible in a world that already felt too small for him. The Thompson farm sat on 37 acres of rolling hills just outside Millbrook, Tennessee, a town where everybody knew everybody's business, and most of that business involved gossip. For 3 generations, the Thompson men had worked this land, coaxing corn and soybeans from soil that grew more stubborn each year. But farming wasn't just getting harder. It was becoming impossible. Corporate agriculture had moved in like a slow-rolling storm, driving down prices and pushing family farms toward bankruptcy. Marcus's father, Daniel Thompson, worked 18-hour days and still couldn't make the numbers add up. The bank letters came more frequently now, each one bringing the family closer to losing everything they'd ever known. At school, Marcus was known simply as a farmer's boy. He sat in the back corner of every classroom, completed his assignments without complaint, and spoke only when directly questioned. His teachers saw a student who was polite but unremarkable. His classmates saw someone who didn't quite fit into their carefully constructed social hierarchies. He wasn't popular enough for the in-crowd, wasn't rebellious enough for the outcasts, and wasn't athletic enough for the sports teams. He existed in a gray space between worlds, belonging fully to none of them. The bullying started small, the way these things always do. Snickers when he walked by wearing the same 3 shirts his mother had bought him at the thrift store. Whispered comments about the smell of hay that seemed to follow him no matter how thoroughly he showered. Paper balls thrown at the back of his head during lunch, accompanied by mock farm animal sounds that made nearby tables erupt in cruel laughter. Marcus absorbed it all in silence, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes fixed on whatever book or assignment lay before him. But the real torment came from Jake Sullivan and his crew. Jake was everything Marcus wasn't. Confident, wealthy, destined for college on his father's dime. His father owned Sullivan Construction, the biggest building company in 3 counties, and Jake never let anyone forget it. He wore his privilege like armor, and he wielded it like a weapon against anyone he deemed beneath him. Marcus, with his second-hand clothes and farm-stained fingernails, made an easy target. The confrontations escalated gradually. What started as name-calling became shoulder checks in hallway. Shoulder checks became shoving matches that Marcus never fought back against, knowing that getting suspended would mean losing precious time needed to help his father. The breaking point came on a gray Tuesday in October, when Jake cornered Marcus by the agriculture building, surrounded by his usual audience of followers hungry for entertainment. "Look what we got here," Jake announced, his voice carrying that particular brand of cruelty that only comes from someone who's never known real hardship. "It's our favorite farm boy. Tell me, Marcus, when your daddy loses a farm, you gonna come work for my dad? I'm sure we could find you a nice spot picking up trash or cleaning toilets." Marcus's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he said nothing. He'd learned long ago that responding only made things worse. "What's the matter?" Jake pressed, stepping closer. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're just too dumb to come up with a comeback. I heard farmers don't need to be smart, just strong enough to shovel manure all day." The circle of students tightened around them, phones appearing as if by magic. Nothing traveled faster through Millbrook High than a good humiliation, especially when it was recorded for posterity. Marcus felt the familiar burning in his chest, the mixture of shame and rage that he'd swallowed down hundreds of times before. He started to turn away, to walk through the crowd and disappear as he always did, but Jake grabbed his shoulder and spun him back around. "I'm talking to you, dirt boy. Don't you walk away from me." For just a moment, Marcus met Jake's eyes, and something flickered there, a flash of fire that burned deep inside him, quickly smothered but not quite extinguished. Then he pulled free from Jake's grip and walked away, leaving behind a wake of laughter and phone cameras. That night, alone in his room above the farmhouse kitchen, Marcus sat on his bed and stared out the window at fields that stretched toward a horizon he'd never crossed. The old wooden radio on his nightstand was tuned to the only station that came in clearly, a Nashville country station that played everything from classic Hank Williams to modern crossover hits. Music had always been Marcus's secret companion, the one thing that belonged entirely to him in a life where everything else was shared, sacrificed, or scrutinized. He pulled out his phone, a 3-year-old model with a cracked screen that his parents had scraped together money to buy him for emergencies, and scrolled through videos of singers who'd made it big. Carrie Underwood, Kelly Clarkson, Chris Stapleton, voices that could fill arenas and move millions of people to tears. He watched their performances with a mixture of longing and disbelief, imagining what it must feel like to stand in front of thousands of people and be truly heard. What nobody at school knew, what nobody in Millbrook knew, was that Marcus Thompson had a voice that could stop traffic. It was a gift that had manifested itself gradually, starting when he was 12 and his voice began to change. Where other boys struggled with cracking and squeaking, Marcus's voice had settled into something rich and powerful, with a range that surprised even him. He discovered it by accident, singing along to the radio while working in the barn, and had been developing it in secret ever since. Every morning before dawn, when the world was still wrapped in darkness and even his early rising father hadn't yet stirred, Marcus would walk out to the farthest pasture on their property. There, surrounded by nothing but sleeping cattle and endless sky, he would sing. He sang everything. Country ballads that reminded him of his grandfather's stories, pop songs he'd heard on his classmates' phones, gospel hymns his mother hummed while cooking Sunday dinner, even opera pieces he discovered on late-night public radio broadcasts. His voice became his escape, his therapy, his way of processing all the frustration and fear that he carried like stones in his chest. When the bank statements piled up on his father's desk, Marcus sang. When Jake Sullivan made his life hell at school, Marcus sang. When he watched his mother count and recount the money in her purse at the grocery store, calculating whether they could afford both bread and milk, Marcus sang. But singing in a pasture was one thing. Singing in front of people was something else entirely, and Marcus had convinced himself it was impossible. He was the invisible boy, the farmer's son who nobody noticed. The idea of standing up in front of others and exposing something so personal, so vulnerable, seemed as foreign as flying to the moon. Then came the announcement that changed everything. Mrs. Patricia Williams, the music teacher who'd been trying to revitalize Millbrook High's performing arts program for 15 years, stood at the front of the school assembly with barely contained excitement. The annual talent show was being expanded this year. She announced, instead of the usual small auditorium performance for parents and faculty, this year's show would be held in the main gymnasium. More importantly, it would be recorded and submitted to a statewide competition, with the winner receiving a $15,000 scholarship to any Tennessee college with a music program. $15,000. For Marcus, who'd already resigned himself to skipping college because his family couldn't afford the tuition, it might as well have been $15 million. He sat in the back of the auditorium, his mind racing with possibilities. That money could change everything. It could be his ticket out of Millbrook, his chance to study music at a real university, maybe even his way of helping his family save the farm. But the thought of actually getting up on that stage, in front of the entire school, in front of Jake Sullivan and everyone who'd ever laughed at him, made his stomach clench with terror. For 3 days, he carried the sign-up sheet in his backpack, taken out occasionally to stare at the empty lines where brave students had written their names. Ashley Martinez was doing a dance routine. The Henderson twins were performing a comedy skit. Even Quiet Sarah Chun had signed up to play piano. But Marcus couldn't bring himself to add his name to the list. The deadline was Friday at 3 p.m. At 2:30, Marcus found himself standing outside Mrs. Williams's classroom, the crumpled sign-up sheet in his sweaty palm. Through the window, he could see her grading papers, her gray hair pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn for as long as anyone could remember. She looked up as he knocked, and her face brightened with the kind of genuine warmth that had made her beloved by generations of students. "Marcus Thompson," she said, opening the door. "What can I do for you?" He stood there for a long moment, The word stuck somewhere between his heart and his throat. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he managed to say, "I'd like to sign up for the talent show." Mrs. Williams took the paper from his hands, her eyes widening slightly as she read his entry. Under type of performance, he'd written simply, vocal. Under song selection, he'd left a blank. "Marcus," she said carefully, "I have to ask, have you ever performed before? I mean, I don't recall you being in choir or participating in any musical activities." He shook his head, his cheeks burning with embarrassment. "No, ma'am. I sing sometimes. At home. I thought maybe—" He trailed off, already regretting his impulsive decision. But Mrs. Williams was looking at him with something that might have been curiosity or maybe hope. "Would you mind singing something for me now? Just so I know what we're working with." The classroom suddenly felt as vast as an ocean. Marcus glanced around at the empty desks, the motivational posters about following your dreams, the piano sitting silent in the corner. His mouth went dry, and for a moment he considered bolting for the door. Instead, he closed his eyes and thought about those early mornings in the pasture, about the freedom he felt when there was nobody around to judge or laugh or record him for social media. He thought about his parents, working themselves to exhaustion to hold on to a dream that was slipping away piece by piece. He thought about $15,000 and what it could mean for his future. Then he began to sing. He chose Amazing Grace, partly because it was simple and familiar, but mostly because it was a song that had always felt like a prayer to him. The first note came out tentative, uncertain, but by the second line, something magical happened. The classroom walls seemed to disappear, replaced by infinite sky and rolling hills. His voice found its power, its range, its soul deep resonance that could make grown men weep and angels pause in their flight. When he finished, the silence stretched between them like a held breath. Mrs. Williams was staring at him with an expression he'd never seen before. Wonder, perhaps, mixed with something that looked almost like disbelief. "Marcus," she said finally, her voice soft with awe, "where on earth did you learn to sing like that?" He shrugged, suddenly self-conscious again. I always could, I guess. I practice sometimes when I'm working around the farm." Mrs. Williams walked over to the piano and played a few notes, then gestured for him to sing them back. He did, effortlessly matching pitch and tone. She played a more complex melody, then a series of challenging runs and riffs that would have stumped most trained singers. Marcus followed every note, his voice adapting and flowing like water finding its course. "Dear Lord," she whispered, more to herself than to him, "Marcus, you have a gift, a real, genuine, God-given gift. Why hadn't you ever shared this before?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. How could he explain years of invisibility, of believing that someone like him didn't deserve to be heard? How could he tell her about the crushing weight of other people's expectations, about the way poverty and social status could make you feel like your dreams were selfish luxuries you couldn't afford? "I guess I never thought anyone would want to listen," he said finally. Mrs. Williams studied his face for a long moment, and Marcus had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through all his carefully constructed walls. "Marcus, I want you to understand something. What you just did, that wasn't just singing. That was art. That was the kind of voice that comes along maybe once in a teacher's career, if they're lucky." She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found what she was looking for. "I'm going to give you the number of a friend of mine, David Chun, Sarah's uncle. Actually, he's a vocal coach in Nashville. Works with some pretty big names in the industry. I want you to record yourself singing anything you want and send it to him. Will you do that for me?" Marcus took the slip of paper she handed him, his hands trembling slightly. "Mrs. Williams, I don't know if I'm ready for all this. I mean, what if I get up there and just freeze?" "Then you'll have tried," she said simply. "And trying is more than most people ever do with their gifts. But Marcus, I don't think you're going to freeze. I think you're going to surprise everyone, including yourself." The weeks leading up to the talent show passed in a blur of nervous energy and secret preparation. Marcus threw himself into farm work with even more intensity than usual, partly to help his father with the autumn harvest, and partly to distract himself from the growing knot of anxiety in his stomach. But every morning, he still made his pilgrimage to the far pasture, where he practiced scales and songs and tried to imagine himself standing in front of 300 people without fainting. He'd sent a recording to David Chun, as Mrs. Williams had suggested, singing a stripped-down version of Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah that he'd learned from years of late-night radio listening. The response came back within 48 hours, a phone call that lasted nearly an hour, during which David peppered him with questions about his musical background, his training, his plans for the future. By the end of the conversation, David had offered to give him free lessons via video chat, an opportunity that felt too good to be true. The lessons were revelatory. David taught him breathing techniques that made his voice even more powerful, showed him how to control his range and dynamics, helped him understand the technical aspects of what he'd been doing by pure instinct. But more importantly, David talked to him about performance, about connecting with an audience, about the difference between singing and communicating. "You've got the voice," David told him during their third session. "But voice alone isn't enough. You need to tell a story, to make people feel something." The greatest singers in history weren't just technically perfect. They were emotionally honest. They let people see their souls through their music. As the talent show approached, word began to spread to the school that Marcus Thompson, quiet, invisible Marcus Thompson, had signed up to perform. The reaction ranged from mild surprise to outright skepticism. Jake Sullivan, in particular, seemed to find the whole thing hilarious. "The farm boy's gonna sing," he announced his friends during lunch, loud enough for half the cafeteria to hear. "This should be good. Maybe he'll moo instead of hitting the high notes." The laughter that followed felt like daggers in Marcus's chest, but he forced himself to keep eating his sandwich, to pretend he hadn't heard. Only 2 weeks left. He could survive 2 more weeks. The night before the talent show, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to the familiar sound of the farm, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through corn stalks, the creak of the old house settling into darkness. His parents were asleep down the hall, exhausted from another 18-hour day of fighting to keep their dream alive. Tomorrow, he would either help secure his family's future or humiliate himself in front of everyone he'd ever known. There didn't seem to be much middle ground. At 4 a.m., he gave up on sleep and walked out to the pasture one last time. The stars were brilliant overhead, untainted by city lights, and the air was crisp with the promise of winter. He stood among the sleeping cattle and sang his chosen song, The Sound of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel, reimagined as a powerful ballad about isolation and the courage to finally speak your truth. As the last note faded into the darkness, Marcus felt something shift inside him. The fear was still there, coiled tight in his chest, but it was tempered now by something else. Determination, maybe, or simply the knowledge that he'd already come too far to turn back. The day of the talent show dawned gray and cold, with low clouds that seemed to press down on the world like a lid on a pot. Marcus moved through his classes in a daze, barely hearing his teachers, unable to focus on anything except the growing knot in his stomach. By lunch, news of his upcoming performance had spread to every corner of the school, and he found himself the subject of whispered conversations and sideways glances. "I heard Marcus Thompson is singing tonight," he overheard Ashley Martinez saying to her friends. "Can you imagine? I've never even heard him speak above a whisper in class." The gymnasium began filling up at 6 p.m., an hour before the show was scheduled to start. Parents and siblings crowded into the bleachers, while students claimed spots on the floor near the makeshift stage that the maintenance crew had assembled. Marcus peeked through the curtain from backstage, really just the equipment storage room behind the stage, and felt his heart hammering against his ribs. 300 people, just as he'd imagined. But somehow the reality was so much more intimidating than his imagination had prepared him for. Mrs. Williams found him there, looking pale and sweaty in his father's old dress shirt and his one pair of dress pants that his mother had pressed until they could stand up on their own. "How are you feeling?" she asked, though his expression probably answered the question. "Like I'm going to throw up," he admitted. She smiled and squeezed his shoulder. "That's normal. Every great performer gets nervous. The trick is to use that energy, channel it into your performance. The audience isn't your enemy, Marcus. They want you to succeed. They want to be moved, to be entertained, to feel something they don't feel in their everyday lives. You have the power to give them that. The show began with Ashley Martinez's dance routine, followed by a comedy skit that had the audience in stitches. The Henderson twins performed their comedy act. Sarah Chun played a beautiful piano piece, and gradually the list of performers dwindled. Marcus was scheduled to go on 19th out of 20 acts. Mrs. Williams had placed him near the end deliberately, she told him, because she wanted the performance to be what people remembered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he heard his name being called. Our next performer is Marcus Thompson, who will be singing The Sound of Silence. The applause was polite but scattered, the kind of response reserved for someone nobody really expected much from. Marcus walked onto the stage on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, his hands trembling slightly as he approached the microphone. The gymnasium lights were blindingly bright, making it impossible to see individual faces in the crowd, which was somehow both terrifying and comforting. He looked out at the sea of people, his classmates, his teachers, his parents sitting in the third row with expressions of nervous pride, Jake Sullivan and his friends clustered near the back with phones already recording. This was it, the moment that would either launch him toward his dreams or confirm every cruel assumption anyone had ever made about the quiet farm boy who didn't belong. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, Marcus stood frozen at the microphone, the silence stretching uncomfortably long. Someone in the back coughed. A few people shifted in their seats. He could almost hear the collective thought rippling through the gymnasium. This was a mistake. Then he closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to sing. "Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again." The first line came out strong and clear, cutting through the gymnasium air like a blade through silk. But it was the second line that changed everything, when Marcus let his voice open up fully, revealing the power and range that he'd been hiding for so long. The effect was instantaneous. The restless shifting in the audience stopped. Phone conversations ceased mid-sentence. Even the janitor, who'd been quietly emptying trash cans at the back of the gymnasium, paused with a garbage bag halfway to the bin. Marcus sang about isolation and loneliness, about the pain of being unheard in a world full of noise. But he also sang about courage, about the moment when silence breaks and truth finally finds its voice. His voice filled every corner of the gymnasium, rich and powerful and achingly beautiful, conveying emotions that he'd never been able to express in ordinary conversation. In the third row, his mother began to cry, pressing her hand to her mouth in wonder. His father sat stunned, recognizing his son's voice, but hardly believing it could be coming from the same boy who barely spoke above a whisper at the dinner table. But the real transformation was happening in Marcus himself. As he sang, he felt years of fear and shame falling away like old clothes. The stage no longer felt like a place of exposure and vulnerability. It felt like home. The audience no longer seemed like a collection of judges waiting to tear him down. They felt like friends, like family, like people who needed to hear exactly what he had to say. When he reached the climax of the song, Marcus let his voice soar to notes that seemed to touch the gymnasium rafters, then brought it down to a whisper so intimate that 300 people held their breath to catch every word. He sang about the sound of silence being broken at last, about finding the courage to speak when everything inside you screams to stay quiet. As the last note faded into absolute silence, Marcus opened his eyes and looked out at the audience. For a moment, nobody moved. 300 people sat in complete stillness, as if they were afraid that any sound might break the spell that had settled over the gymnasium. Then someone started clapping, a single pair of hands somewhere in the middle of the bleachers. Within seconds, the entire gymnasium exploded in applause. People leaped to their feet, whistling and cheering and shouting his name. His mother was sobbing openly now. His father was wiping tears from his eyes, and even some of his classmates who'd never given him a second glance were applauding with genuine enthusiasm. But the moment that would stay with Marcus forever came when he spotted Jake Sullivan in the back of the gymnasium. The boy who'd tormented him for years was standing with the rest of the crowd, his phone forgotten in his hand, his mouth slightly open in something that might have been shock or respect or simply recognition that he'd been wrong about everything he thought he knew about Marcus Thompson. Mrs. Williams rushed onto the stage as soon as the applause began to die down, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said into the microphone, her voice thick with emotion, I think we've just witnessed something very special. The final act of the talent show was almost anticlimactic after Marcus's performance. When the judges, 3 local musicians and the principal, announced the winner, nobody in the gymnasium was surprised to hear Marcus's name called. The $15,000 scholarship was his, along with something even more valuable, the knowledge that he had a voice worth hearing and the courage to use it. But the real prize came afterward, during the reception in the cafeteria, when people who'd never spoken to him before approached to shake his hand and tell him how moved they'd been by his performance. His phone, which rarely rang with anything other than calls from his parents, began buzzing with friend requests and messages from classmates, from people in the community, even from a few music industry professionals who'd heard about his performance through social media posts that were already going viral. David Chun called that night, so excited he could barely contain himself. "Marcus, I've got to ask, have you given any thought to Nashville? Because I've got some friends who would love to hear you sing." 3 months later, Marcus Thompson stood on a much bigger stage in Nashville, Tennessee, auditioning for a record label that had heard about the farm boy with the voice of an angel, the same voice that had once been his secret, his escape, his private rebellion against a world that tried to make him invisible, was now opening doors he'd never imagined possible. He still helped his father with the farm work, but now there was hope on the horizon. The scholarship had secured a spot at Belmont University's music program, and the demo he'd recorded was already generating interest from industry professionals. More importantly, the $15,000 had bought his family time. Time to restructure their debt, time to explore new agricultural opportunities, time to hold on to the land that had been in their family for 3 generations. But perhaps the most profound change was in Marcus himself. The boy who'd once perfected the art of invisibility now walked to the halls of Millbrook High, with his head held high, not because he'd become arrogant or forgotten where he came from, but because he'd finally learned the difference between being humble and being invisible. He'd discovered that having a gift meant nothing if you kept it buried in the ground, that sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't staying silent. It's finding the strength to let your voice be heard. The morning after his Nashville audition, Marcus walked out to the same pasture where he'd practiced for so many years. The cattle looked up as he approached, as if they too recognized that something fundamental had changed. He stood among them in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of the farm that would always be part of him, no matter how far his music might take him. Then, as the first light of sunrise painted the horizon gold and pink, Marcus Thompson began to sing. Not because he was hiding from the world anymore, but because he finally understood that his voice, his gift, his truth, his contribution to the great conversation of humanity was meant to be shared. The sound carried across the fields, over the farmhouse where his parents slept peacefully for the first time in years, beyond the boundaries of their 37 acres, and into a future bright with possibility. It was the sound of a dream finally given voice, a potential realized, of a young man who'd learned that sometimes the greatest transformations happen not when you change who you are, but when you finally have the courage to show the world who you've always been. And in that moment, as his voice rose with the sun over the Tennessee hills, Marcus Thompson understood the most important lesson of all, that every voice matters. Every story deserves to be told, and sometimes the most extraordinary gifts come wrapped in the most ordinary packages. You just have to be brave enough to unwrap them